Okay, so in this video we're going to talk about approaches, methods and techniques, especially for young learners. Okay, so this video is going to cover quite a range of different things, from general approaches to methods to specific techniques. We're going to talk about the history of these things a little bit, and at the end we're going to talk about the post-method era. Okay, so let's have a look at what we're going to talk about today. First, what is an approach, a method and a technique? So I'm going to give you like an overview of this, and then approaches for young learners, and then a brief history of TESOL approaches and methods, and how these fit into EFL and ESL context. Okay, so English as a foreign language and English as a second language, these different contexts, kind of how does it relate to methodology. We're also going to talk about the post-method era and finish off talking about personal methodology. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so first let's look at this overview. Okay, and at the top here you can see learning theories. Now, approaches, methods and techniques come from our concepts and ideas about what is learning. Okay, so over time we've developed different understandings of learning, and different ideas about how learning happens have come about. So these different theories about what is learning and what encourages learning and how do we learn, these things become approaches to teaching. Okay, so these are theories about how to teach that match the idea we have about learning. Okay, so this is an approach, which is an assumption about how to engage learners. Okay, so there are different approaches influenced by different viewpoints of learning. So approach is the overall, you can see in the kind of red large circle, approach is the overall aspect of this. And then a smaller, within that, you have the orange circle. This is the method. So the method is the actions that engage learning. Okay, so the approach is the kind of the concept of the idea. The method is the action. So the method comes from the approach. Okay, so different approaches would have different methods. And then you can see in the smaller yellow circles, techniques. So there can be different methods for the same approach. There can also be different techniques for the same method. Okay, so one method might have a range of techniques. Techniques are classroom strategies, very specific things that we do in the classroom. So you can see from this kind of very general overview how these things fit together. Okay, theories about learning influence approaches to teaching. That becomes a method, which is a series of actions, and then within a method you might have various techniques. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so approaches for young learners. I'm going to give a summary of some of the important kind of ideas and concepts that I think are relevant for teaching young learners. Okay, the first one is behaviorism, or the behaviorist approach. This approach, this idea about teaching is that language can be structured into a syllabus of manageable parts. Repetition is good, it involves rewards and motivation, and it's all about modelled pronunciation and modelled language. Okay, so behaviorist is a very kind of step-by-step way of teaching. We teach language as parts, okay, as grammar parts or as expressions, repeating, practicing again and again, and then kind of building on that the next week or you know, as students develop. Okay, so we're going to look in the history of approaches. We're going to look a little bit more about behaviorism. Okay, the next one is multiple intelligence theory. This is actually one of my favorites. This idea is that all learners have different strengths. Activities should be varied to match those different types of learners, and that lessons should be multimodal, using different modes of communication or media or materials. Okay. Now, multiple intelligence theory, one thing that I should say at first, there is no empirical evidence for this. Okay, this idea was kind of developed on intuition. So that is a weakness, and I think that in certain fields or certain disciplines, we wouldn't really discuss multiple intelligence because like I said, there's no actual hard data for this. Okay, but I think in our field, which is teaching, I think that it is a very useful idea and concept, and it kind of helps teachers to develop interesting lessons, varied activities, good materials. So, you know, when you're developing materials, you can think about multiple intelligences, and it might give you some ideas about how to extend or add to your materials or activities. So I do think it's really useful. I have another video about multiple intelligences, and I'm probably going to make a new video about it soon with more detail. Okay, so it's kind of like a learning style, but not exactly. It's more it's more about the range of skills and abilities that we have as humans, and we all have like a range of different things. Some of us prefer visual things, some of us prefer listening to things, some of us prefer kind of logical puzzles and things like this. Okay, so that's multiple intelligence theory, and we'll discuss that more in other videos. Okay, so the input hypothesis, this is from Krashen's 5 hypotheses. So learners need input before output. This is related to Krashen's silent period, that learners need time for input, okay, and they need silent time to absorb and to process the new things that they're learning. Okay, so this is the input hypothesis, input approach. Okay, the next one is humanist. Young learners are people and have their own opinions, reasons, and emotions that should be respected. So this is kind of the humanist approach to education. Not just language teaching, this is a general approach to education. Okay, notice it's very different from behaviorism. Behaviorism kind of treats learners like robots or animals to be trained. Okay, the humanist approach is all about kind of the full human, the emotions, the experiences that we have. Okay, the final one is the constructivist approach. Learners need to challenge and construct their own need to be challenged and construct their own understandings of language and meaning. Okay, so this idea is that learners construct their own understanding of the world. They construct their own understanding of language, for example. This is kind of quite closely related to Piaget and Vygotsky. Again, I'll probably make another video about that. So they are some of the big names in the field in terms of young learner education. They were all about kind of social interaction and constructing ourselves with the support of others and kind of making sense of the world around us. Okay, so these 5 approaches have been suggested as the kind of some of the good approaches to keep in mind when we're teaching young learners. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more detail now. This is about behaviorism. Okay, so Skinner was one of the people who developed this. It's called the father of modern behaviorism, and he introduced this idea of operant conditioning, which is basically conditioning people or animals to do things. Okay, kind of doesn't sound very nice when you talk about it like that, but the idea is that okay, so you can see the table below. The mouse pushes the lever and then they get a reward. Okay, so this is conditioning the mouse to do something. Now if we take that to, you may have heard of Pavlov's dog, right? You ring the bell and the dog comes. So Pavlov was one of the previous people who kind of developed these ideas. Okay, and you can see the table at the bottom here. So this is in relation to teaching children. The child has a stimulus, some kind of input, some kind of task or activity or a question. They respond and they get positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. Okay, of course the negative reinforcement would stop them responding in that way, and they would try to find a different kind of response. But if they get positive reinforcement, then they will think that that response is correct. Okay, so as I mentioned, this kind of idea about the way that humans learn does kind of treat us like robots. So a lot of people do criticize this. It does leave out a lot of what makes us individuals and what makes us humans. And you know, we can't just treat everybody like an on and off switch. Okay, so behaviorism led to audiolingualism. In terms of language teaching now, Audiolingualism was one of the early approaches, one of the early methods, I should say. This was known as the army method because it kind of really came to the fore in the I think around the 40s and 50s and 60s was the period of audiolingualism, and at this time a lot of people, a lot of soldiers or agents needed to learn language, and they needed to learn it quickly. So what they did, you can see the picture here, they would listen and repeat and listen and repeat, and they would learn language that way. So in World War II, large numbers of military personnel needed to learn to speak foreign languages quickly, and they used this technique to kind of train the soldiers. Okay, it's interesting that what I said about behaviorism being kind of treating people like robots. Well, in military field, you know, the soldiers are kind of treated like robots. So this kind of method, behaviorism, became the audiolingualism method in language teaching. Okay, but let's move on. Another interesting one is total physical response. I'm going to do another video about this. This was created by James D. Asher on the premise that language is learned primarily through listening. So it's a method for listening that really focuses on listening. Next, language learning must engage the right brain hemisphere. Okay, so you can see this other image here with the person with the brain and the left brain and the right brain. Now, again, something I should mention here is this is not literally true, okay? It seems to have kind of really grabbed a lot of people's attention, and a lot of people think that now this is 100% true. So it's not actually true that our brains are split and one side is one and one side is the other, okay? So don't think of this as literally true, that our brain has a left and a right side. But as an idea and a concept, I think it is valid and useful to have this kind of idea, as long as we know that it's not literal truth. So you can see here, according to this, the left brain is for logic, analysis, sequencing, and so on, the kind of logical side of our brain. The right brain is all about creativity, imagination, arts, and so on. So total physical response was an attempt to address the imbalance between the left brain and the right brain in teaching. So it brings more of the kind of creative side of our brain processing into it. Okay, and the final point here, language learning should not involve stress. Okay, so that's total physical response, and a very useful technique for teaching young learners. Okay, next, communicative language teaching. This came out of the approach that looked at language and considered it as a way of communicating meaning. Okay, and so this led to a different kind of approach to teaching. The late 60s, I think the 70s and the 80s, this really came to the fore, and it came out of our understanding of functional language and how we change our language in different situations as well. So communicative language teaching, here are some typical activities: role play, icebreakers, information gap, jigsaw tasks, problem solving, surveys, discussion, and debate. Okay, so communicative language teaching treats language as a tool we use to communicate. Okay, we communicate things about ourselves. We use language for, dealing with the outside world. Okay, now this is how many methods, approaches, and techniques fit into the different contexts of EFL and ESL. Okay, so EFL is English as a foreign language, and the Korean context where I am now, this is an EFL context because English is a foreign language. It's very different from ESL, which is English as a second language. So there are other contexts, such as if a Korean goes to study in North America or Britain or Australia, then they would be an ESL student because they're living in the target language culture and they're learning the English as a second language. Okay, so you can see here on this chart, EFL is at one side. In the middle, you've got EFL and ESL kind of combined, and then on the other side, you've got ESL. So on the EFL side, this is more structure-based instruction. In this context, you're more likely to find things like grammar translation method. AL is audio-lingualism. You have CLT, but the weak version of CLT. Okay, so communicative language teaching. The weak version means scaffolded. So in the weak version, there would be language focus exercises to support and help learners in their communicative tasks. And the final one on the EFL side is PPP, present, practice, produce, which is an old kind of teaching framework. It's not totally out of fashion. I'm sure it happens in many classrooms, but it is a kind of more traditional way of looking at language, where we present and then explicitly practice and then have a production stage of 3 stages of a lesson. So in an EFL context, you're more likely to find these things: GTM, CLT, weak version, AL, and PPP. Okay, if we move to the middle now, here you have kind of communicative instruction. So here could be combined EFL, ESL. It could be either context. So there you have CLT, communicative language teaching, the strong form of CLT. The strong form means that students you may have like a warm-up kind of introduction stage to set the context and prepare, but then you quickly throw students into communication. Okay, there's no scaffolding, there's no language exercises, there's no explicit instruction. You throw them more quickly into communication and expressing themselves and trying to complete some kind of activity, or it could be a task. Then it would be task-based language teaching. But you aren't giving them kind of language support. Some people believe in the strong version of CLT. Some people believe in the weak version of CLT. But I do think it depends on the context and the students. If the students are higher level, then strong version is fine. If the students are lower level, then I would suggest the weaker version of CLT. Okay, you also have under CLT strong, you have TBI, task-based instruction. Okay, so basing instruction around tasks. So that's quite closely related to CLT. And then moving over, you've got CLIL, which is content and language integrated learning. Okay, content and language integrated learning. So this is teaching content, but integrating it with language learning. And then below that, you've got content-based instruction. This is moving over towards ESL side now. Content-based instruction would be teaching content like history or math or science. So essentially basically teaching subjects in the second language. It's not really language teaching. Okay, I guess CLIL would be in that type of instruction. There would be some awareness that language is part of the teaching, but in content-based instruction, it's just teaching content, not teaching language, and students learn the language through learning the content. Okay, moving over, you've got immersion, and then finally submersion, so sink and swim. So this is on the ESL side. This would be like a Korean student going to live in Canada, going to a school in Canada. That would be total immersion. Okay, they wouldn't really have any language scaffolding or language lessons to help them. They'd learn language by complete immersion. So this is closer to natural acquisition. So you can see here how some of the approaches kind of match different types of contexts. Now I would suggest we are in the EFL side. For low level and younger learners, you can kind of be more closer to the red circle in terms of your teaching, with weak CLT especially. If your students are higher level, then you could be over to CLT, the strong version, task-based instruction, or even perhaps content and language integrated learning. So, using newspapers or kind of current events and just practicing language through discussing things like that. Okay, so I hope that was interesting and useful. Let's move on. Okay. This is kind of related to the next topic, but I'm not going to give you too much about it straight away. But have a look at this. Now, behaviorism, and which led to the audiolingual method. Here we have Pavlov, Watson, and Skinner, some of the architects of this approach. And the way that this kind of spread through education and society was it came from these academics and these theorists, and it came down to language teachers. Okay. And this is the natural approach, Krashen and Terrell. And again, these academics came up with ideas, and this kind of filtered down to language teachers. And the TPR, the total physical response, again, Asher developed this idea, and it kind of filtered down to language teachers. And the communicative approach, communicative language teaching, various things happened to develop this. It actually took quite a few decades for this to develop, with various different viewpoints and ideas. So you can see a summary there on the screen. But essentially, various people came up with ideas, and these ideas kind of filtered down to language teachers. So think about the last few slides. What do they look like? What's wrong with this traditional approach to the spread of methodology? It seems like all of these things are coming down to us from academics or experts, and these things are filtering down through our understanding of education into our education systems and so on. So this has actually been challenged in the last few decades. People have said that the way that we're looking at this system is completely wrong, and it shouldn't be that these figures develop an idea and that we should have to follow this idea that has been developed by somebody. So there's kind of been a paradigm shift in the way that we view methodology, which has kind of switched this idea. It's very top to bottom, this idea of these theories coming down to language teachers. And people have realized that actually language teachers should be at the top, or should be at the center of this idea. So this has changed, and one of the texts that helped to kind of solidify this new idea is called the Post-Method Condition, Emerging Strategies for Second and Foreign Language Teaching. And this really quite seminal paper by Kumaravadivelu, this seminal paper kind of suggested that actually the way that we look at methods is wrong, and methods don't come from experts. Methods come from teachers, and teachers do whatever they want to do in the classroom. They find the mix of methods that works for them based on the context, based on the learners, based on their ideas about teaching and learning. So this has kind of created a shift in the last few decades, and rather than looking at this as a top-down approach, there's been this change that we should look at it in a different way. Okay, so the post-method era looks at it like this, that the language teachers are the center. The language teachers, let me read the green text. The language teachers become practitioners and self-directed theorizers who construct their own theory of practice. So we have all these methods and approaches now, all of these ideas about education, but it's up to you as a teacher to find the right balance of these various methods and approaches. You are the person in the classroom. You're the one interacting with your students. You know what's best, okay? And this idea of these theories coming down from these ivory towers has been challenged now. So this has led to something interesting. Personal methodology, also called principled eclecticism. Eclecticism means a mix, and a principled means that we choose the mix based on solid ideas and principles. So this has become quite a common topic in the last few decades. A lot of people now are talking about personal methodology and principled eclecticism. This is context sensitive, so it's sensitive to your situation, the age of your students, the level of your students, their development, what kind of institution you're teaching in, and so on. It's location specific, okay? What is the linguistic background of your students? What is the socio-cultural setting of your teaching? What is the political setting of your education? And through action research, teachers theorize from their practice and practice what they theorize. Okay, so the idea now is that researchers do not exist separate from us. We are the researchers. We do research by teaching and finding out what works and then adapting our teaching in the classroom. And finally, teachers become the catalyst for change. So really it's up to you to find the right balance of approaches and methods and techniques that work in your situation. Okay, I hope that was useful. I'll see you in the next video.